Well, in the last year, I think that I think a lot of things have been kind of, I suppose, solidifying. I got tenure not this spring but last spring, and so I've been experiencing what it's like to have job security for the first time in you know, decades, and that's been very nice. The kind of the fallout of that, just, you know, I feel much freer in what I'm doing with my teaching, and kind of able to start doing things in, I feel like I can pay more attention to my instincts, and there's not a little voice behind you saying you need to do this to get tenure, that to get tenure. And so I think that's freeing up a lot of energy. And other than that, there's still no writing going on. And Katrina and I were talking about this before you came, and Katrina reminded me that this guy we knew in Lawrence, who was kind of he was a massage therapist and a bit of a guru and so on, had once said, you know, if you consider yourself to be not writing, it must mean you're a writer, because most people are not writing. So if you're worried about not writing, you're a writer. And so, but that's the only sign of being a writer I've had lately. I had written co-wrote a screenplay of the novel Vestments, and we finished that over a year ago, I think. And my writing partner moved back out to Hollywood. He'd gone to film school at UCLA and been in Hollywood for 20 years, and then came back here in the 90s to raise his kids, and just sold his estate out by Lake Minnetonka and moved back to Hollywood. And last I talked to him about a year ago, he had a couple of projects in development, other novels that he had adapted. So I hope I'll hear from him someday. I kind of feel like everything's in stasis, though, waiting for me to start writing again. I have this superstition that when you're not writing, you don't win awards, and your other projects don't move forward, even if they're done. And so, so superstitiously, I'm putting a lot of pressure on myself to write, because I think I've got to start some new writing for anything good to happen with the old writing. And other than that, I think one of the big things, and this goes back to having tenure and so on, that's happened in the last year, this summer, I usually, you know, at the end of the school year, hope to get my classes prepped for the following year, and then don't, and worry about it all summer, and then do them at the last moment before classes start in the fall, and then feel like I'm behind all year. And this summer, for the first time ever, and I think it came out of maybe having tenure, I just sat down at the end of the semester and prepped and made copies for my fall class and wrote assignments and kind of roughed in my spring classes. And I think that's going to have benefits for throughout the entire coming school year. I think one of the great hazards of being professors is that it's a job that expands to fill the time available, and I feel like so often it's not only me but professors in general. It's people I observe and try to have coffee with and so on. We're all kind of because in a way you can never prep a class enough or too much. It seems like everybody is trying to create the perfect class and putting a tremendous amount of pressure on themselves to teach perfectly, which of course is impossible. And so you spend a lot of time worrying and make professing kind of an open-ended task. And I'm trying to close it off and decide, you know, for this class, for this freshman comp class or this fiction writing class or whatever, this is good enough for this semester. And hopefully free up more time to actually interact with my students and with my own writing and with my own life. So I think that's, you know, a rambling rambling, and I guess I'm looking forward to seeing what the fallout of that is over the school year of going into the fall very much ahead on preparation and so on. So, and I think that's kind of a wrap up of everything that's been going on.
So, what's with Anna?
Anna is starting to talk and develop an imagination, and that's a lot of fun. She's almost done with being 3 at this time. At this time last summer, she would have still been in the terrible twos, and so she started preschool last fall, and she loved it. We actually extended her school day an hour because she used to cry when we came to pick her up, and it seemed not a reflection that we ran a terrible household, but that she really loved school, and she was in the chair. It's interesting watching her brain develop and watching stuff click in. She'd been in the terrible twos for about a year, and there were days when she would fight us on every single thing that came up. And about a week before the end of school for her in the fall, she came home and she had learned to count, and she'd known her numbers, like up to 14 for some reason. She'd known her numbers for a long time, but she would just, if you showed her 4 fingers, she'd count them until she got to 14. And one day, with about a week left in school, she came home and she was counting everything, and she would count. If you showed her 4 fingers, she'd count to 4. So she understood numbers represented something. And that very same day, the terrible twos behavior stopped. It just dropped off the table. I mean, she's still a little kid, and there are days she fights you a lot, and she can be very contrary or very, very squirrely, I think, is a trying to get her to focus sometimes. But the kind of the overall level of the behavior changed, and it changed in a day. It was like some neurons connected, and all of a sudden we had this different kid who knew how to count and wasn't fighting us on everything. And it's fascinating to watch that sort of thing happen. And what we're watching happen now is a real takeoff in social development and conversational ability and so on. She's always been a very physical kid. She's got a great sense of balance, and she climbs in places that scare me and that I would never have been able to climb at any age. And she just stands there, and you can tell that it doesn't even occur to her that you shouldn't be standing on top of a rock 6 feet in the air, because why not? And, so that's fun. It's fun watching her physically, but now her social and imagination and conversational skills seem to be taking a jump to catch up with the physical side. So it's a lot of fun.
Any new insights about teaching?
Oh, insights about teaching. I think I guess what it is, to go back to what we were talking about, is getting less worry about what's happening up front, less worry about trying to prep the perfect class or write the perfect assignment, and realizing that, like the same as with art and writing, it's a process. And so if you want to live a full life as a teacher, you don't get drawn into this idea that somehow you're going to write the perfect freshman comp class or write the perfect assignment that's going to get great papers. You tweak what you've got, and then you say that's good enough, and you stop worrying about it. And again, my sense is that gives more time to interact with students and to see what they need, and to kind of have fun with your life as a teacher, rather than constantly worrying about whether you're doing things good enough. And so it's kind of putting a cap on the prep process, and hopefully opening up time for the more interactive parts of it, and for the other parts of your life, again. It seems a lot of times if you live in the world of professors, you find that people, like for the 9 months during school year, they go underground and you can't even get a coffee date with anybody, and walk into somebody's office and they look desperately at the clock because they're so busy, they've overwhelmed themselves so much. And I don't necessarily think that's the best way to teach, and I sure don't think it's the best way to live. And so I'm trying to balance out my life so that I do more prep work during the summer, but have more free time during the school year, and everything's a little bit more balanced. I guess that's my insight into teaching the year.
So, and how are you thinking about writing now?
This has been a constant thing. I've gotten a long way away from my writing, and so I think that, and I haven't written in a while, and of course the longer you go without writing, the bigger the prospect of starting writing becomes, and the harder it becomes. And I'm trying to apply some of the lessons from teaching to the idea of writing, that it doesn't have to be perfect, that it's a process, that it just needs to be underway, that it should be a part of everyday life without overwhelming it, and then we'll see what happens from there. I guess excuse me. I guess one of the motivating factors for me, and this is a very practical one, but in a lot of ways I think it's one that's going to work for me, is I'm eligible for a sabbatical in a couple of years. And I want to make it. I'm lucky to have to work at a college where the creative project. I have to have a pedagogical aspect to it, but my college will support a creative project for sabbatical, and so I want to be writing when I come into sabbatical so that I can make the best use of that time. And in some ways it's a completely practical motivation for writing, but I think that's what I need.
I had an apartment last summer, and I more than once had the thought, this is the perfect sabbatical apartment for John and Katrina. It was in Vienna, midway between the museum and the zoo, on a good subway line. Actually, I just had a room, but that was enough. Given your investment in St. Paul, Catholicism, in the last book, is your sabbatical going to have to be here or close to here for feeling the vibrations and keeping the cadences in your ear and so forth?
There is that. More practically speaking, Katrina and my sabbaticals won't be at the same time. And we've got, a small child, and so sabbatical is going to be here. But I actually think that's better. This is, I'm very comfortable here and I'm very happy here, and a lot of times that idea of going away to this beautiful place to have solitude to work, that can work sometimes, but a lot of times it's just distracting. You're trying to figure out where the grocery store is, and where the light switches are and how to do the laundry, rather than putting that energy into creativity. So actually I'm very much looking forward to a sabbatical and being in my own house for it.
Yeah. So you must run into students who've never written or who don't remember, or never written seriously in your comp classes. How do you advise them about getting started?
I think it's a very simple thing. In a lot of ways you can't make it too complicated. You just, you give them a basic essay form. you know, everybody, you know, runs down the 5-paragraph essay, but a basic essay form, that's a good basic essay form, and you give them that form to hang on to, and once they've got the form out of the way, and you say you need this here, it actually prompts creativity and thinking, in the same way that, God, I feel like I've said this before in one of these films. In the same way, say a sonnet. You know, if you're working with you know, undergraduate poets, they'll be afraid that having to write, say, in the form of a sonnet will you know, strangle their creativity. Where really, you know, that idea that you've got to write, you know, 5-beat, roughly 10 syllable lines, and that you've got to have this rhyme scheme and so on and so forth, spurs creativity. And, you know, because you search to meet the syllable count or the rhyme scheme or whatever, you search for words you wouldn't have usually used, and sentence patterns and so on. And so form can spur creativity because of its requirements, and it also just frees up, maybe more prosaically in the form of the freshman essay, form frees up your energy to worry about, you know, reading comprehension and what you actually think and so on, rather than saying, oh God, how do I put this information, what shape do I put the information in? And so a lot of my freshman class is just beating a very basic shape for the essay into their head. And you know, I'll leave it to their other teachers, the philosophers like you, to give them something to pour into that shape.
So, do you have hovering before you something like boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl, the novel form?
I think so, yeah.
Well, I look forward to hearing what happens over the next year.
Yeah, so do I. So.
Go ahead.
How has our life together been in the past year? Busy, multitasking.
Yeah, I think it's starting to come back. Everybody says you start to get your life back as your kid gets closer to 4, so I think.
That's been the most significant thing to me in the last year, is this sudden awareness that we have been on an island for a few years where we don't know what movies have come out. We don't know what restaurants are open. People say, have you heard about? And the answer is always no. You know, somebody turned to me at one point recently and said, when did you realize that Birdman was all done in one shot? And I thought, what's Birdman? That's a movie, right? You know, and
it's got one shot, it must be a movie.
But I mean, we were so deeply involved in taking care of Anna and working the first year or two that I didn't really notice how separate we were. But now that we're starting to gain some consciousness again, gain a little bit of freedom again, I'm suddenly aware of how long we've been separated in some ways from the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is having a kid good for a marriage?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. It depends on whether your marriage is on the way up or the way down. But I think if you've got a functioning marriage, it's going to strengthen it. If you've got a dysfunctional marriage, it's probably going to help it disintegrate. But I don't know. I think it's been good for our marriage.
I think.
You don't have any news for me like that. You know, the guy in the Up series who confesses his multiple affairs to his wife on camera.
No, nothing like
okay.
I do. Yeah, there's a street theater right here, but I think that a lot of times people use having a child to justify the way they've imagined the world to be structured all along.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it really depends. For us, I think it's been good. I think it's been great to see aspects of each other that we didn't see before.
I'm wondering whether any of this is going to come through the street cleaner out there. But yeah, and I think, I mean, overall, having a kid teaches you to put a cap on tasks and on your time. You don't tend to, again, you know, if you're an artist and a professor and you know, tasks tend to expand to fill the available space. And I think having a kid is a great lesson, and this is good enough. We can keep afloat for you know, the next hour or the next week or whatever on this. And so I think there are lessons to be learned from there that you take into, you know, your relationship with the world and your teaching and your writing and each other. And yeah.
And I mean, it's kind of the obvious question, but you don't have to answer it. What happens with the fact that you're not writing the same amount, that you're not on the same inner clock with writing? Is that an issue? Is that a problem? Is that something that sort of creates a tension?
Well, it does. I mean, I've been really concentrating this summer on being able to get my writing back. So I've got it's funny how quickly it comes back. It's gone for a while because you're doing other things, but once you sit down, it's like piano. You know, I played piano for a number of years, and when you're rusty, you're really rusty, but your body remembers. And the other thing that's been interesting about it is how it's changed what I have to say.
Yeah, I think as a writer, anytime you're not writing, hopefully your life is filling the well that you draw from for your writing. So I kind of haven't. I've tried not to really worry about it.
I had a friend once who kept a plastic dummy in the corner of her apartment that she used to physically abuse for not practicing.
Wow.
Beat on the dummy.
You know, there's a poet friend of mine. When I was pregnant, I was sleeping all the time, and it was really hard for me to write because all I did was nap. And she said to me, "Notes count," and I thought notes don't count. But I was reading a lot of my journals this summer, and I'll talk with you about this in a little bit. And I found that journal from when I was pregnant, and I didn't even try to write actual poems or essays. I just wrote drafts. And, you know, she was right, that the notes really do count. Now I've got this lovely notebook full of 4-year-old drafts that I can play with or not. And so I think that there is always something you can do.
Well, thank you.
Well, the last year, it's you know, it's funny that somebody said about children that the days are long but the years are short, and that is really true, because when I think back over the last year, each day seems just really, really long, but it has been a very quick year. It was a year during which, at least during the school year, I did not get a lot of writing done, and it's a summer during which I've gotten an awful lot of writing done because I made it my main thing. But before I talk about the writing, I want to talk about something I did a couple weeks ago, which was that I burned 15 years worth of journals. And I knew you and I were talking about journals before we started filming today, and I said to you we could have an interesting talk about this. I always kept a journal in a 3-subject need notebook, you know, real plain. I wrote all the way to the margins on both sides. I didn't keep margins. Sometimes I didn't keep the top one, sometimes I did, but they were just thick on both sides with writing. And my friends in publishing that I said, I'm going to burn all my journals, they all looked kind of leery or alarmed. And my poet friends, when I said it, they all kind of nodded and said, yeah, I tossed mine too. So it seems like it's a relatively common thing. And I have one friend who just looked really alarmed and shouted no. But she's a poet whose father was also a poet and died of Alzheimer's disease a few years ago, and she really treasures his journals and getting to read them. And I did it because I had kind of I had done something I always tell my writing students not to do, but I had done it, which is that I'd sort of mixed together my writing journal and my daily kind of processing freak out journal. And they were all just it was all mixed together. And every time I was getting ready to leave on a plane or go on a trip or something, I would panic that I was going to die while I was on the road, and all of these journals would be all that my family had left of me, and that there was just a lot of stuff that I didn't really want people to read or see as sort of the last thing they would know about me. And so I decided to get rid of them, and then from here on out kind of keep those things a little more separate, my writing notebook, my sort of personal journal. And it took, John and I burned them in the fire pit in the backyard a couple weeks ago. It took me all summer to read them until this point. In some ways it really irritated me because I was trying to get a lot of writing in, and it was definitely taking away from my writing time. But I also found lots of drafts of things that I would like to work on, and when I found something that intrigued me still, I ripped it out, so I kept all those. And it takes a really long time to burn a notebook. You would think, I'm now imagining that people who burn books, that it probably is not so easy to burn a book. And notebooks are really dense. It turned out you had to poke them quite a bit with the poker to get some air between the pages. There's a really great scene in a Bernard Cooper memoir about him being young and being gay and not wanting to be out about it. And so he's got this magazine that he's trying to burn in his garage before anybody knows he has it, and he lights it, and something about the fire sort of makes all the pages separate and take flight, and all of these burning pages of naked men are sifting through his garage, through the air, as he is in panic. And John and I kept joking about, not having a Bernard Cooper moment in the backyard. But it took a good hour or two to burn them all, because we didn't want the fire to get too big and catch our trees on fire or something. And I did keep I found a lot more interesting drafts and projects than I thought I would find in there, and including things that were almost done but not quite. So I thought I would start by, I'm going to read a poem that I found partly done in there, and I just finished it, and it's called Tomatoes. The best ones I ever ate, I ate that summer. Tim gone 6 months, me not yet forevered again to anyone. Tomatoes the only fever, many-chambered, jelly-seeded, probably slicers, nothing rare, dissected into a glass bowl night after night for a dinner date with the pulpy sun on its way through my yard. This was Fayetteville, Arkansas, a city of wreckage and wisteria, noisy cicadas and washing machines in front yards. The August air humid, nearly liquid. Oil, mozzarella, basil, salts. One evening I sat on my back stoop, eating in a puddle of light, and knew I could live without him, and was. Before the child, love again, before St. Paul and all of that, I lived on $700 a month and ate the same dinner from the same bowl until decision ceased to be decision.
Your concern in burning your journals was about how you'd be remembered.
Mm-hmm.
Wondering if you could say a little more about that.
Sure. Well, I always get really torn about this question because there's sort of there's one set of beliefs about what it means to be a writer, and it's that you just write what you have to write and you don't care, and it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks of you. It doesn't matter what awful things you say about people you love. Nothing matters but the art. And I'm just, as I get older, I'm just not so sure that's true. I think your personal relationships matter an awful lot. And, Alice Munro always had a policy of not writing about her children. And I'm almost positive I said this to you 10 years ago. And somebody asked her why, and she said, because I want them to talk to me when I'm old. And so I write for part of the day, but there's a big chunk of the day I spend in the grocery store and with my child and talking to my parents on the phone. And I feel a certain obligation to my ties with the world, and I see writing as an outpouring of that, but I don't, there are certain things that just don't need to be shared, I don't think. And I did feel some qualms about, there were things I didn't really want to go, there were bits of, there were quotes from writers that I liked. There were early drafts of poems that I could see had turned into other poems. There were, little musings on books I'd read or movies I'd seen or art exhibits. But I feel like it finally taught me really concretely what I wanted and needed in my writer's notebook. What I need to work, because all that kind of boring processing stuff you do where you're just trying to emotionally make sense of your world, that stuff's not interesting 10 years later. It's not interesting 10 days later sometimes. But it finally really hit home to me that those two things are separate. And at one point I think I had lied to myself and said, oh, but I draw so much from my personal life, I need all this personal stuff. It can all be in the same notebook. But really they are two really different ways of thinking.
Can you talk the difference a little bit? I mean, like the way you would with a class.
Sure. I'll talk about it a little bit. And it's, I think, I don't know, I don't mean that you need to censor yourself, because I'm not talking about writing something as if it's written for other people. But there really is a difference between trying to figure out whether you should break up with somebody, trying to figure out why your mother made you so mad in some conversation the day before, or something that is really, I'm going to use the word selfish, but I don't mean it entirely pejoratively, it's more about the self, it's more about who are you, but I don't know that it's necessarily interesting to other people. And then there are things that become art, and those are different. Those can come from your life too. There is this really cool thing somebody taught me years ago, and I never remembered the connection to Chekhov. I think I've told you about it before, and it's 10 true things about, the date of the day before, August 9th, 2015. And then you write 10 true sentences of things that happened the day before. I would find those scattered through my journals. Those were lovely. 10 years later, 5 years later, they always evoked a day so completely, and always in such a way that I could suddenly remember that day. And those were 10 images, usually. Something about the weather, something about watching the boys 3 doors down, sitting in the convertible of a car, sitting in the convertible with the top down, with their heads up looking at the sun. That was all personal stuff from my life too, but because the focus was the image and not emotions. I think it's the same as what I teach students about poetry, about about thinking in image and not in simply in abstractions. And that really does make a difference in the way you see. I think it makes a difference in my mood, to be honest. I think sort of sitting with your, for me, kind of ruminating over negative things doesn't tend to make me work better the rest of the day. So there's a real difference.
One topic that's coming up here is kind of processing emotion. And I'm wondering, I mean, the way you've pictured it here is that emotion gets processed kind of off stage. And then you write seriously stuff that might endure, and that's a different thing. Is that right? Am I hearing that right?
Not completely. Yes and no. There are two different ways to process emotion, I think. And I think, because I think when you're writing, like in the process of writing that tomato poem, I discovered emotions in the process of writing it. And adhering to the image, I uncovered something I didn't know I knew. And what it was that idea of, by focusing on the tomato becomes sort of like a heart, and that heart gets cut up every night and eaten for dinner in the same bowl. And it happens over and over until the person, the speaker has worked through their feelings. So when I sat down to write it, I was just thinking about tomatoes and about that summer and how many tomatoes I ate for dinner on that porch. If I had started with the emotions, I would start with something that I already knew. And so I don't know that I would have discovered something over the course of it.
So it's kind of whether the image or the emotion is the starting point.
I think so. I think if you lead with the image as a writer, if you start with an image and you uncover from there, that you will discover what intuitive things lie underneath that. But if you start with the emotion, you don't always. I don't know that you can go further with that. Not artistically. It's a valid way of thinking, but it's not. I don't know that it helps you discover anything.
So, we got some things to read this time.
I've got a few things to read. I've been switching over a lot to prose, and I mean, to some extent that tomato poem really surprised me, just because I wouldn't have written it if I hadn't already mostly written it, just because writing in those little concise pieces has not really fit my life for a little while. But the other thing that surprised me is that I've been writing a lot about my former partner Tim again, who was the subject of my first book, and I really thought I was done writing about him after Atlas came out 10 years ago. And I was done writing about him, mostly, and it wasn't until I had a daughter again that I suddenly found myself revisiting all of that material, because I found myself thinking again about all those young men with hemophilia and HIV from the point of view of a parent, and thinking more this time, especially about hemophilia, which I didn't think about a lot when we were together in my early 20s, because AIDS was so much part of the national conscious at that time. But now thinking a lot more about hemophilia. There's a great book that I'll talk about a little bit later by Robert Massey about his son with hemophilia. But I've been working on this essay about the communion of saints and about all the men I knew with hemophilia, and so I'll read you this little excerpt. Like saints, they were not afraid to die. They were reckless, really. There were two kinds of hemophiliacs, we said amongst ourselves. The first kind stayed home and let their mothers infuse their factor for them until they found a girlfriend or wife to take over the job. The other kind, nearly every hemophiliac I knew was the other kind, were daredevils who had been told all their lives by parents and teachers and nurses that they were fragile and responded by testing every limit they could. And once a life-threatening virus had been added to the mix, well, most of the ones I knew were incorrigible. One of them jumped from airplanes. One haunted California estate sales, buying props to be used in the movies he worked on, and had a way with beautiful women. At his funeral, he was eulogized by 3 ex-girlfriends. One teetered on the edge of a roof of a 4-story building in high winds as Hurricane Gloria moved up the coast toward Boston, yelling, "Come and get me, Gloria!" When Tim was a teenager, he would see how long he could drive on the highway with his eyes closed. When Tim was 12, he and another boy would drink several Mickey's Big Mouths, then see how hard they could hit each other. One, as he emerged from a coma, was asked a series of questions by his doctor. "What's your name? Who's the president?" When the doctor asked what year it was, he deadpanned, "It's the year the Red Sox win it all." The poet hemophiliac Tom Andrews did off-road motorcycle racing as a teenager. Eventually, reluctantly, he gave it up and instead wrote a book of poems, The Hemophiliac's Motorcycle. When Andrews was 11, he got himself listed in the Guinness Book of World Records for clapping his hands for 14 hours and 31 minutes straight. He even clapped under the table through a family meal at Pizza Hut. He refused to stop to eat, but did concede to drinking root beer through a straw, clapping all the while. None of his nurses ever figured out how he did it without getting an elbow bleed. One of us should have told the editors of Andrew's memoir, Codeine Diary, True Confessions of a Reckless Hemophiliac, that we found the words reckless and hemophiliac to be redundant. Andrews could also roll downhill on a skateboard that was on top of another skateboard while doing a handstand. Of course he could. I don't. The only thing I can think of about why I've returned to this is that is the idea of parenthood. Is that now I'm starting to think about all these boys with hemophilia, and how their parents were dealing with it. And to be honest, Tim managed his hemophilia so well that I didn't really pay attention to it, and so I didn't understand until just pretty recently. This year I read the book Journey by Robert and Suzanne Massey about their son having hemophilia, and he was born in the 50s, and hemophilia was such a different world then. That hemophilia really was considered, a handicap. It was that they never got it officially named to be one, but really 90% of men with hemophilia born in 1950 didn't make it to the age of 21. And then of that 10% who did, I think 90% of them ended up either bedridden or addicted to painkillers. And so I think that's some of the reason you saw, at least I saw some of those very reckless men, is that any of them who were a little bit older than we were had already beaten incredible odds just to get to that age and be, walking around and doing all kinds of things. And so I view them as a population with an incredible amount of resilience and as I said, even recklessness. And other than parenthood, I'm not sure why they're so much a part of my head these days again.
The word saints came into this.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've been thinking about saints.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a little bit there?
Sure. Some of it was just the way I remember so many of them dying, and it was that a lot of them, when they were close to death, suddenly started talking about the others as if they were there in the room. And it just seemed like that they had this sort of community that, whether it was actually true or not, seemed to stretch across the realm of the living and the dead. And that they weren't afraid to die themselves. And so, I was writing in my notebook about all of this, and I just wrote the line, they remind me of the communion of saints. And then I thought, well, I'll explore that and see where it goes. And the other thing about it, too, was that the public viewed them as saints, though in a different way. Hemophiliacs were actually the first poster children of the AIDS epidemic. And it was because you had a group of people who had been infected. You could put sweet teenage boys on a poster who had done nothing but take the medicine. The public was very, you might remember, really focused on blame in the early days of the AIDS epidemic. So, people getting AIDS from having sex, or sharing needles, but here was somebody like Ryan White who wanted to go to school, or somebody like Ricky Ray who also wanted to go to school. Actually, there was a little boy named Philip Teepee who wanted to be able to play basketball with his high school team, and I think people could understand. Those were ways that they could access the idea that anybody could get HIV. I think now people are further along and understand that, but then I don't know that they did, and so there was this sort of saintly viewing of them at that time that I think is interesting too, especially when contrasted with the very human ways I knew them. I'll just read you the first paragraph from this because I think it sums it up. One of them jumped from airplanes. One of them designed Harvard's first email system, and by the time he died at age 62, had made and lost a fortune 3 times. One of them financed the last 2 years of his illness by starting one of the internet's first pornography sites. By then, he had a brain infection and couldn't think very well, but the girlfriend he'd met at MIT, whose Chinese parents were so conservative he had never even been permitted to meet them, managed the site. Another was an activist who designed clinical drug trials and was named to an honorary team tasked with finding an AIDS vaccine by Dr. Jonas Salk. The one I loved best was 21 when I met him, too young to have any such accomplishments. He loved basketball and tried to write short stories like those of Tobias Wolff. So, they were very human, obviously, and so to me that some of the fun is the contrast too.
So you saw a lot of people die early on in your life, and how they died made a big impression and became really important. Yeah. And there's this Catholic idea that all life is kind of preparation for the moment of death, for doing that right somehow. And that ties to sainthood. You don't have to accomplish very much if you die right. And Teresa the Little Flower died right. But also people who have to suffer, and who don't take that as a reason to become bitter, kind of get into the club sometimes. But it must be very different now. I mean, you're in a death is at a distance now. You're in the middle of a family life, at beginning of a career in a way. I mean, you can estimate, if all goes well, decades before you have to take death seriously again. we don't have to think that way, but you maybe could. And it's funny because this isn't distant for you. It could be.
I don't know. Statistically, women are closest to death in childbirth, apparently. That you have a greater chance of dying in childbirth than almost anything else. And most women I know, when they gave birth, thought a lot about dying. And parenting has changed my relationship to death in an interesting way. And I think to some extent, I don't want to say I'm not afraid to die, because I think everybody is. But I feel some sort of shift in my relationship to the world since my daughter was born. I think I don't know if it's just primal, because my genes have been passed on now, where I think, okay, if I do. But other, there's other things too. We were crossing the street the other day, and this car didn't see us as we were crossing, and I automatically did this thing. I don't know, really, if the truck had swung into us, I don't know that anything would have, that my putting my hands out that way would have done anything. But I was, completely ready to somehow block her from the truck, and so maybe there is that recurrence too, that idea of looking at death again as a parent when you've got, to some extent, some sort of primal instinct to care for the child first. But as far as saints go, I was raised in the Episcopal Church, and I still attend the Episcopal Church, so I don't quite have the same relationship with saints that the Catholics do, I think. And maybe that's part of the reason they're interesting to me. They have interesting lives, and sometimes they're not entirely sure that they were even real. There's a couple of saints who've been, I don't know what they call it. What are you desainted or something like that? But there are a couple of them that they're pretty sure never existed, that they were only a story. And but I think that we've kind of lost track of what a saint actually was supposed to be, because in the early Christian church anybody was a saint, and everybody could be a saint. And but I think we've made the idea that it's somebody who's increasingly not touchable, someone not human, somebody somehow better than us, and that I don't think that was the original intent.
Can we go back for just a second to an old project? Because I kind of want the next story on that. You were working on a prose project involving fictionalized accounts of a girl's visit to a zoo, to the Como Zoo and Conservatory. What happened to that project?
It still is. I wasn't sure what parts I'd read aloud in a previous interview, so I didn't bring it down with me today. But it's sort of starting to close itself off. It's starting to kind of wind down. It's mostly it's just a set of little prose poems or little prose pieces about the zoo. It pretty much ends with Anna growing old enough that she doesn't want to go anymore. She wants to hang out with her friends. And in the same way that I'm pretty sure my daughter at some point will tire of going to the zoo with us and start wanting to hang out with her friends. But that was really surprising when that opened. And I'm not entirely sure it's finished, in that I kind of wonder whether the speaker, Miss Carl is the name of the older neighbor, I wonder whether she will at some point kind of drop out of it, and the speaker will just be me. But right now for whatever reason, it's been interesting and safe to have this older neighbor and this little girl whose name is Anna and is yet not my daughter.
So I remember when we talked last time, the milestone was going to be when Anna was old enough to ride the amusement park rides, that then it would have to change. Mm-hmm. Has that happened yet?
She is tall enough to ride the rides. In fact, you might remember her outburst in here, just a few minutes ago. We've since packed her off to Como Town and the rides. She's probably on the swings right now. But she'll still go to the zoo sometimes, which is interesting. She was at the zoo just yesterday and she visited the primate house and the big cats, and she's got a very set route through the zoo that she takes. She knows all the animals, she knows the animals' names, and she has opinions about them, and kind of a set ritual. It usually ends in the cafe. But today she went. I thought she was going to be so fascinated by the rides that she'd abandon the zoo, and she didn't. But she has abandoned the conservatory, and that makes me sad. I do have a piece I could read that it actually deals with both Anna and my partner Tim, so it might fit all of this. It might be a nice way to sort of tie all this together. It doesn't have a good title. So I'll tell you the title right now is Leaf Turning, but I don't think it'll stay that. My friend Mary knows that in Minneapolis, lilacs bloom around her daughter's birthday, because when she went into the hospital to give birth, there were none. And when she reemerged at the door with the child in her arms, the bushes were heavy and fragrant. Similarly, sugar maples redden here in the first week of October. I know because when I left for the hospital to birth my daughter, the leaves were green. And when I left a few days later, my room did not have a window. Some leaves were red, others were yellow, and the world was suffused in amber light. I have been reading about tools. Not pliers and hammers, but items I had never considered as tools. Clocks and calendars and maps. Tools, I read, deaden the same part of the body they amplify. A hammer amplifies the power of the hand, but desensitizes the hand to whatever is being nailed down or through or together. So the calendar makes us more aware of one kind of time, the May 7th, October 3rd kind, and less aware of time as we have always felt it in our bodies, maple reddening time, lilac time. A happy medium, perhaps. The Ojibwe tribe, native to Minnesota, used the moon as a calendar and named the full moons for what was happening in that part of the year. There was a moon for strawberries, another for rice, and another still for the crusting of snow. Mary's daughter Mara was born during budding moon. My daughter was born at leaf-turning moon. Every year around my daughter's birthday in early October, I twin myself. Once again, I find myself capable of becoming two bodies. I remain in the body I have always known, noting the squares on the calendar, but I also walk through the world in a body that knows it is time again for maples. For a few days, I exist in both bodies at once. It is tempting to call the more primal sense of awareness the better, more pure one, but really it is the cleaving itself that feels singular. Gradually, over the course of the month, I become a single body again. I am tempted to say that birth changed the way I saw forever, but really lots of strong memories make me feel this way. The blue, blue skies of mid-October are always the color of heartbreak, because it was then I found out that my partner Tim would die very soon. We wanted to marry but didn't. We lived far from Minnesota, in the Ozarks, the oldest mountains in my country, so old their peaks have long been worn by weather. There was a yellow bungalow with a front porch and a swing to read in, and a distant view of the foothills in the direction of the sunset. The slant of light and seasons there were different, but even here in Minnesota, after more than 20 years, every mid-October I hear a faint keening in my chest, as if for the first time. He is dying. He is dying. How many lives will my body remember by the time I am done? How many moons and strawberries, births and deaths, how many circles around? Or maybe I am saying that any strong experience is a kind of birth. On those days when I live in two bodies, I feel both lost and found, as I felt on the day my husband and I drove home our newborn Anna from the hospital. The leaves ticked in the wind and wavered, making shadows of their hands on the street. We were overly careful, vigilant at each stop sign, aware of every movement in the corners of our eyes.
That's very nice.
Thank you.
So, does this writing come together into collections anytime soon?
I hope it does.
Is there a worldly plan for it to get out?
There is, and I don't want to talk about what I think is going to happen with it too much because it's still in process. But yeah, it's been very much a generative summer. I mean, there's been much more generation of new work than anything else, and the pages are piling up. You know, I've got some things I've told you about Amy Klempet and some things about Anna and the conservatory, and I've got the things I'm writing now, and I'm starting to see some threads of how it all comes together. So, you know, my goal in the next year is to start kind of putting caps on things and putting them places and starting to see where they fit together.
Maybe several projects, and maybe something that combines them.
I initially, you know, for a while I saw several different projects, but now I'm starting to wonder whether they are actually a single project. And I think you and I were talking about collecting things, and I think for me, I'm naturally interested in so many things that for me being able to complete creative works involves taking things away rather than adding, because I can always add. I can always find another book I like. I can always find something else I want to think about. So for me, I think a lot of it is going to involve starting to pare things back, and because there's definitely enough stuff and no end to what it could be.
Thank you.